So, we're going to talk about William James tonight. And I want to begin with a couple of show and tells. Well, first of all, we're going to be looking at this book. We're going to be talking about two chapters from this book, William James's Pragmatism. You have it probably in this version. And I've been fortunate in my life to have interactions with some really wonderful James scholars. One person who worked on James for many years, who some of whose videos are on YouTube and other places, is a great philosopher, John J. McDermott. And McDermott is just a legend as a philosopher himself. He's an incredible expert on William James and Josiah Royce, but also on Dewey as well. So unfortunately, McDermott is no longer with us, but he was a dramatic and influential and deeply scholarly and sensitive person, and he is very much missed. The other person I wanted to show you a picture of is this is another wonderful James interpreter. Her name is Charlene Haddock Zeichfried, and she is a James expert and an expert on feminism and pragmatism. And this is a picture of us. Let's see if you can see it. Yeah, this is a picture of us on top of Kierkegaard's church in Copenhagen. We were both there for a conference, and I snapped this picture, and she's just a lovely human being as well. So today we want to start by talking about James's essay, What Pragmatism Means. And this is chapter 2 in James's Pragmatism. So I want to talk about James's example of the squirrel, James's use of purse, the pragmatic method, the corridor philosophy, the idea that pragmatism is a kind of corridor, something about pragmatism's theory of truth, and then give a little bit of a summary and talk about James's idea that philosophy often comes down to matters of temperament, and so we will talk about that as well. So we're going to begin talking about James's chapter 2 of his book Pragmatism, and this chapter is entitled What Pragmatism Means. There's a very big agenda in his book Pragmatism, this series of lectures that he gave in 1906 and 1907. In this book, or this series of lectures, James would make peace between the theological and the religious sides of philosophy and of life, the scientific views, which seem to be clashing with them based on grounds of materialism sort of versus theism. James wants to champion the scientific method without supporting materialistic determinism. He wants to criticize the dogma of the rationalists, the dogma as he saw it, without arguing for atomistic and deterministic forms of empiricism. James wants to insist on our free will, and he also wants to insist on the world's creative and changing character without claiming that there are no constraints at all. Whatever we choose to believe as good and as just is not true just because we believe it. We are constrained by the world. We are constrained by what we think and by what other people think. But this does not result in a foundationalism or in an absolutism. There are two very exciting things in James's view as far as I'm concerned. One is that in James you find a view of truth that's not absolute and it's not fixed, but it's not anything goes either. You find a view about knowledge where knowledge is not only the product of our concepts and our perceptions, but knowledge is also equipment for living. Philosophy and life have come together again. They have something to do with one another in the philosophy of William James. The epistemological heart of what James is saying here is his pragmatism. And James in these essays takes Peirce's principle, his pragmatic maxim, and he develops it according to his own needs and interests and philosophical opinions. For James, the pragmatic principle is developed in ways where the consequences of what we think and believe depend very much on our personal concerns and our philosophical concerns. So if we go to the beginning of the book, or of this chapter rather, we see James talking about a man and a squirrel. And James has just come back from what he calls a solitary ramble in the forest, and he finds philosophers, who for some reason he goes camping with philosophers. He finds them arguing about the metaphysical interpretation of whether or not a man who is running around a tree with a squirrel on the other side, sort of moving along with him, whether the man goes around the squirrel or not. And as we can see from the discussion, and which is meant to illustrate the pragmatic principle, James shows us that what the answer to that metaphysical question is depends very much on how we interpret the phrase goes around. So he's invoking the pragmatic principle because he's trying to show that if we meet a question which we have trouble determining the answer to, often an interpretation of the meaning of the terms and their pragmatic implications will tell us what will happen whether we go with one interpretation or whether we go with another. So pragmatism resolves this dispute by asking for the practical differences between the two cases. Do we mean relative position or do we mean absolute position? If you make the distinction and you specify the practical meaning, an answer is possible. Right? It's like that old case of if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Well, this, as everybody knows after their first philosophy class, depends on whether sound is the perception of sound or whether it is physical vibrations in the air. So the question of which definition is ultimately correct is dissolved by the pragmatic principle because we understand that we need to define the meaning of our terms based on the uses to which we would put them. So you see here, as I mentioned before, that James is using Peirce's ideas. Peirce said in his lectures that to attain clarity of the object of our thought, you need to consider the practical effects it might have. He says, then the conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. And that's from How to Make Our Ideas Clear. So Peirce's pragmatic principle gives us a way to find the clear meaning of terms where clarity depends on the ability to carry out experimentation and observation. And so for Peirce, the meanings of the terms that we use must be expressible in tests that we do or we could do. The pragmatic method, as James employs it, has those scientific connotations, but for James, he is expanding it to include personal outcomes and outcomes that might be measured, you might say, in feelings, emotions, and our spiritual well-being. So James wants to use this principle, Peirce's principle, as a more generalized method, not only for clarifying terms, but for dissolving philosophical and metaphysical disputes that have some bearing on our lives in the world. The key, James says, is that something has to be at stake. And this was true for Peirce too. Peirce said, we're not going to doubt just because we can invent a doubt. There has to be something at stake. So James says, and this is from Pragmatism, he says, it's astonishing to see how many philosophical disputes collapse into insignificance the moment you subject them to the simple test of tracing a concrete consequence. There can be no difference anywhere that doesn't make a difference elsewhere. No difference in abstract truth that doesn't express itself in a difference in concrete fact and in conduct consequent upon that fact, imposed on somebody, somehow, somewhere, and somewhen. The whole function of philosophy, James says, ought to be to find out what definite difference it will make to you and me at definite instance of our life if this world formula or that world formula be the true one. So James has adopted Peirce's pragmatic method and modified it. He's made it more personal. He's made it more contingent to individual circumstances than Peirce surely would have allowed or been comfortable with. I want to move on now and talk about James's dissatisfaction with the rationalist method. Rationalism, as James argues, relies on terms that are so general and so abstract that they cannot be tested, directly experienced, or verified. Rationalism Rationalism has an attitude problem, according to James, and that attitude is that it's retrospective and not prospective, right? It looks back, or it looks to some ideal state of reality and not forward to sort of the hurly-burly of the future world in which we're going to live. The aim of rationalism is to find some magic term that ends all questions, and it's usually a single term. It's like God or matter or reason or the absolute or energy. These are terms, James says, which are so many solving names. You can rest when you have them, he says. You are at the end of your metaphysical quest. Pragmatism, on the other hand, sees concepts and theories not as magic names or as solving words. Pragmatists see concepts and theories as tools. They're directing conceptions, as Dewey puts it. So for pragmatists, the theories that we have or the terms that we use, they become instruments. They're not answers to enigmas. Once we have them, we can rest. We don't lie back upon them. We move forward with these things, with these tools, and on occasion, we may even make nature or our lives over again with the use of these tools, concepts, theories, terms, propositions. Pragmatism, James says, is a corridor philosophy. What does it mean for a philosophy to be a corridor, right? A hallway. James says, well, let's think about how pragmatism works. What does it do? He says, think about the way a corridor works. Pragmatism is a method. It's a way of getting from one place to another. It doesn't stand for any particular results, even religious ones. This is what he claims. Pragmatism is an attitude towards theorizing, not a theory with a content all of its own. Notice how James puts it, and I want to quote from the text again. He says, pragmatism lies in the midst of our theories like a corridor in a hotel. Innumerable chambers open out of it. In one you may find a man writing an atheistic volume. In the next, someone is on his knees praying for faith and strength. In the third, a chemist investigating the body's properties. In a fourth, a system of idealist metaphysics is being excogitated. In a fifth, the impossibility of a metaphysics. So I think one thing we can ask about this metaphor of the corridor is what's it saying about the content of pragmatism? How is pragmatism different as a philosophy? Is it a philosophy in the traditional sense? Right? It seems to be primarily methodological. I think this is a thing that is worth keeping open in our minds, is whether or not James is absolutely literal here. It seems like it must be more somehow, but that's probably something we should talk about. At any rate, this is a philosophy which is set into a context that we all already understand, the context of life. All theories, whatever they are, have to be set into some kind of a context, something that's not itself a theory, right? It's set into our lives. James sometimes refers to this as the stream of experience, but a more humble and probably a more accurate word is simply our life.